What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. Alright, so today I got a chance to look at part one of Goliath, which is a new documentary. And I was wrong in something I said yesterday, and I had to make a big correction. Goliath is not on Netflix. It's on Showtime. I don't know whether or not in the future it's going to be on Netflix. I must have read something wrong. But it debuted on Showtime. Alright? And I think it's on another station, but I watched it on Showtime. I definitely know it could be seen on Showtime. It might be seen on another platform. It might be Epix. But I know it's definitely on Showtime. So, I watched the first episode, part one. I might watch part two tonight. But I watched part one today. And did I learn anything new? Me personally? Because look, I'm different from most people because I'm a big Wilt guy. I didn't really learn anything. I saw some footage that I hadn't seen before. I didn't know that he did it either a joint interview with or he was on the same panel with Richard Nixon. I know he was a Nixon supporter in 1968. I'm pretty sure they're going to get into that later on about how that kind of alienated Wilt from the black community at the time. But I really didn't learn anything new that they presented. I knew Wilt had a stutter when he was growing up. I knew Wilt was shy. I knew he was teased growing up. I am glad that they... If you're young, and if you watch the documentary, that part, I'm glad that they put out there that being a tall, freakishly tall black man at that time wasn't seen as a lottery ticket like it is today. Today, if some gangly kid is 6'6" or taller at age 14, well, their parents have money stars, money signs in their eyes. Coaches see potential. They see a kid that could potentially be a basketball star, right? The problem will be, his coordination, his ability, and his love for the game. And interest, I guess. But back then, when Wilt was a teenager or 14 years old, you're talking about 1950, 51, yeah, you had George Mikan, but the reality was the NBA was just starting out at that time, and it was almost as bad as Major League Baseball was as far as no black athletes. I think it was only in 1950 when the first black player was even drafted. And they had no black stars. And the mindset back then wasn't, okay, this guy's 7 feet tall, he should be a basketball star. It didn't work like that. As a matter of fact, most of the stars outside of George Mikan in the NBA at that time are probably 6'7" and under. So Wilt grew up in a different time period. But Wilt was the first black real superstar. Now, I tend to say Bill Russell. Bill Russell was the first star. But as far as personality, you probably have to go with Wilt Chamberlain being the first black superstar in sports. And I'm glad they touched on something that needed to be touched on. And that is the taboo of Wilt Chamberlain dating white women back in the 60s. Wilt was very shy growing up. He was shy with girls. He didn't have much confidence in himself as a young person because of being teased all the time because of his height. He probably wore a lot of ill-fitting clothes growing up because he was growing so tall, and he was teased mercilessly. But by the time he got into athletics, it was something he excelled at. His stutter began to As the documentary said, his stutter began to go away and his confidence grew. And his confidence in women grew, I think, as we all know. There's one thing that stands out, though, that I didn't like, and that was when they were discussing the 1961-62 season. And they were talking about how, in context now, the 61-62 season isn't as impressive as it was once seen. It was some person that was interviewing, and from what I could see on social media, he's catching flack for saying this. He was saying, well, when you look at pace and you look at, other factors, his field goal percentage that year, and you look at a lot of different other things, well, the 61-62 season really isn't as impressive as we once thought it was. And he said that's reflected in the fact that Bill Russell was overwhelmingly voted as NBA MVP. But you got to look at certain things too when you come to that conclusion. Number one, Wilt Chamberlain couldn't do the things that Shaq could do playing. Wilt couldn't be offensively aggressive. Wilt couldn't lower his shoulder into a defender and literally try to power drive him into the ground and score over him, or lower his shoulder and try to back the game. He couldn't do it. They would have called an offensive foul every time. So Wilt was forced to be an actual basketball player. As a matter of fact, I think until like the very, very late 60s, big men could double hand check in the post. Double hand check. A big man could double hand check you, and a defender, a guy like Havlicek, let's say he's going against the Boston Celtics, could be coming and swiping for the ball if you're Wilt. So oftentimes Wilt was forced into taking a heavily pressured shot. But he still averaged 29 points and 29 rebounds against Bill Russell in his career. And as I've said multiple times before, when Wilt Chamberlain, especially when he was with the Philadelphia Warriors, later on the San Francisco Warriors, whenever they were matched up against the Boston Celtics, the games were often decided not between the matchup between Russell and Chamberlain, but the game was decided between the backcourt. Oftentimes, earlier on especially, the backcourt of Chamberlain was Guy Rodgers and Paul Arizin. Now, Paul Arizin was a two-time scoring champion in the 50s, 52 and 57, but by 1962, he was on the downside of his career. Matter of fact, I believe he retired after the 62-63 season. And Guy Rodgers was a pass-first point guard who was not a scorer. Now, you contrast that with Bob Cousy, who could score. As a matter of fact, this is a man that once scored 50 points in a playoff game. And you had the Steph Curry of his era, Bill Sharman, who was the first player to shoot 40% from the floor in a season. Then later on, you had a defensive demon in K.C. Jones, the scoring prowess of Sam Jones, probably the second best shooting guard in the NBA in the 1960s after Jerry West, and Hondo Havlicek. So Boston often, on the wing and in the perimeter, they just were outmatching Wilt's teams. They couldn't contain that scoring. The backcourt would outscore Wilt's teams 63 to 24 or 27. But what does that mean? Wilt has to score now, especially if you consider Havlicek's dropping 29 and Tom Gola's dropping 13. Well, hell, that means Wilt has to drop 50-something, 60-something. Can't do that every game, especially against Boston's defense. So I just want to put that out there because sometimes I think it's a little bit unfair with the Wilt always is a loser thing. And, if Wilt could bully ball like Shaq could, Wilt would have averaged even more points and been even more efficient. So I do want to put that out there. I know some people say it's excuses, but I'm talking actual facts. It was the rules. Look, to make it simpler, Shaq couldn't play in the 1960s. He couldn't. Not the way he played. And that's the way Shaq played. But he would not have been able to play basketball in the 1960s. If you notice, it wasn't until the 1970s when we start seeing Wilt dunking the ball a lot more. Why? Because it was only then that defensive rules began to lax more, so centers were able to create the separation to separate from the defender and dunk the basketball. And part of that, my friends, is because of the influence of the ABA, which was a high, above the rim type of league. The NBA was so conservative for so many years, and the influence and the threat of the ABA finally caused the NBA to relinquish some of its rules and make it a more fan-friendly game. They started laxing the rules when it comes to passing. So a guy like Pete Maravich could do his thing. A guy like Nate Archibald, a playground legend, could do his thing. And it started laxing his rules, so the more athletic players, like Connie Hawkins, they finally let in the NBA in 1970. Hopefully they wanted a Julius Erving to come in, but he went to the ABA. They wanted these guys to shine. So they finally began to lax some of their defensive rules. And that's why players were able to do certain things in the 70s that they couldn't do in the 60s, along with some of the cultural changes. But anyway, all in all, I didn't have a problem with Goliath. I thought it was an okay. It's okay. It's like it stopped around the early 1960s. So I'm sure part 2 is going to pick up from the early 1960s onward. I'm looking forward to the part where they start talking about Wilt's political affiliation. That's what I'm really interested in, because I think that's a part of Wilt Chamberlain that's misunderstood. But anyway, tell me what you guys think. And what you thought about that documentary, that part, if you have seen it. I haven't. If you've seen parts 2 and parts 3, you can hint at it, but really talk about part 1.